you found out that we had 96 people join us last week on the internet. I have no idea why. I don't advertise this. Nobody knows about it except for us. But it was just kind of interesting. And I must have had 3 people from the early service go home and figure out, well, what did we miss? So there were 3 more that turned up by the 11 o'clock service. So I don't know that we broke 100 last week, but I'm not sure what it means. Because the internet's not real. It's not real. Just keep telling yourself that. As we get closer to November 3rd, just remind yourself, everything you read on the internet is not real. They're not real people. It's just bits and bytes sent over a line. So I just would adjure you once again to be civil in the last few weeks going up to the election. Be generous and be loving. Well, good. I'm glad you voted. I thought about it, but I'm going November 3rd. I'm going in person, and that's how it is. So I've only missed 1 election since I was 18. I voted absentee ballot for years when I was in college and seminary. So it's a right and a privilege a lot of people would give a lot for. So I don't care who you vote for, just go vote. Make sure you do that. So there we go. So last week we are, just to review, we are in long story short. There's stuff in the chapter that I'm not going through because I have 11-year-olds. If you want to go through some of that stuff, I would be glad to meet with you and we can talk about it. Otherwise, we're just going to skim on over it and assume that reading it was fine. So last week we talked about the garden. And the garden was built how? What were the characteristics of the garden we talked about last week? Y'all remember? Most creation myths did all creation in conflict, and there were fighting, and there were people eating people, and swallowing people whole, and making sure, and killing people, and tearing them up to make the earth and the heavens. But the biblical creation narrative is different how? Got to speak up there, guy, because I'm a long way away. That's right. It was all harmony, and in creation, everything is built to live in community with everything else. So when you look at the world, and the Philippines are threatening to go to war with Canada, y'all missed that last year, because Canada was, this is green, liberal, progressive Canada. And I can say that because I used to go there every week or two, or twice a week sometimes. I would sing there. Have lots of friends in Canada. And I had to laugh because they were sending all their garbage off the coast of the Philippines and dumping it in the ocean. And guess where it all wound up? On the Philippine beaches. And the Philippines said, you stop that or we're going to war. And you just have to laugh. I just sat there thinking about the Philippines going to war with Canada. I thought, that's pretty funny. But in an ideal world where we take care of each other and we take care of the world, stuff like that doesn't happen. Stuff like that doesn't happen. So we are in a broken world, and today we are going to talk about the conflict that comes in the story. You can't have a good story without conflict. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. McNeil talk to you. There we go. We're all sorry.
Did God really say? Well, the first chapter in the plot line of Scripture was called Creation from and for Communion. The second chapter is entitled The Fall. And it's here that really, with a question from a serpent, that we begin to see the entrance of evil and danger into the storyline of Scripture. And one of the things that any writer, any storyteller will tell you is that the essential element of any good story is conflict. Without conflict, there's nothing to be resolved. And so far in the scriptures, we haven't seen a lot of that. We're told that it's not good for the man to be alone, but we don't have the presence of sin and death in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so the question is, well, then why is there so much evil, so much pain, so much suffering in our world today? And the answer is the fall, the entrance of sin and evil into God's story. The British writer G.K. Chesterton said a strange thing. He said that the doctrine or the teaching of the fall is the most encouraging view of life because it says that we have misused a good world rather than simply being entrapped inside a bad one. We've misused a good world rather than being trapped inside an evil one. And so while the fall is frightening and sad and terrible, it actually tells us that this is not the way it's supposed to be on planet Earth. The fall starts with a question, as we said, a question from a serpent. And if you're new to the scriptures, the Bible is not like a Disney movie. The animals don't normally talk. It doesn't happen frequently. But this serpent, as Sigmund Freud would like to say, is more than just a serpent. We learn in the book of Revelation that this is kind of like an embodiment of the evil one, the devil, the Satan. And while we don't know a lot about this serpent early on, we come to see him as the enemy of God. And one of the things that's true within the scriptures is that God created all things good. And yet, he endows within his creation a degree of freedom so that it's possible for us to turn away from God. It's possible for us to misuse our freedom. And one of the things that stands out when we read the story in Genesis chapter 3, the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the tree and the fruit, it can sound mythical. It can sound made up, a talking serpent and a forbidden fruit. But when we really look into it, we see that our own falls, our own shortcomings, our own sins are playing out in very, very similar ways. The fall begins with a question: did God really say? And in our own experience, when we turn away from God, it begins oftentimes with a question of whether God really has our best interests at heart, whether we can really trust his word. And that question begins to grow inside of us until we are willing to turn away from God. Another thing that we see is the serpent tells Adam and Eve that you can be like God. And in one sense, someone once said that the essence of sin, in many cases, is trying to be like God in a way other than God has commanded. In essence, it's trying to be your own God, thinking that I know better, I can do better, I don't need anyone telling me what to do. It begins with questioning God's goodness, and it moves on to actually wanting God's job. It also talks in the scriptures about how the man and the woman, they saw the fruit, that it was pleasing to the eye. And in many cases, this is how our own sin story plays out as well. We see something that is forbidden, something that God has said is off limits, and we begin to desire it. We begin to want it, not knowing that it actually leads to destruction and death. A fourth feature in this sort of progression of sin is the effect, what sin brings after we have entered into it. And with Adam and Eve, one of the first emotions is shame. They seek to hide, to cover themselves because something has gone wrong at a level that they can't even wrap words around. Brene Brown talks about shame, and she differentiates it from guilt. And on one level, guilt is saying that I've done wrong. And in many cases, that's true. And guilt can have a good effect if it leads us to repentance and to remorse. But shame is a deeper emotion. Shame says not just that I've done wrong, but that I am wrong. And the question is, who can redeem us? Who can take away that if I am wrong? And so this same progression plays out not just in Adam and Eve, but in all of our lives as we turn away from God. The good news is, even in Genesis chapter 3, we have hints that sin, that death, don't get the final say in God's story. In Genesis 3:15, we learn that the seed of the woman will will crush the serpent's head. This is sometimes called the proto-evangelium, the first gospel telling in the scriptures. That even when things seem blackest, seem bleakest, seem worse, seem most shameful and most hopeless, that God has not abandoned his creation to death, to shame, and to decay. And so as you're reading this passage about the fall in Genesis 3 or the passages in the New Testament, don't just think about it as something that happened back then. Think about it as something that happens even now, today. How have I given myself over to the tempting words of the serpent? How have I questioned God's goodness? How have I begun to desire things that actually lead to destruction? One of the questions we have to ask is, why does God give us the rules, the commands that he gives us in Scripture? Especially the command about the fruit can seem arbitrary. One of the things we begin to learn in Scripture that God's commands are not attempts to steal or to rob us of our joy. They're actually attempts to give us the fullest possible life. And so even when we don't understand them, we can trust the nature and the intentions of God. That when he says that something is out of bounds, it's not because he wants to rob us of enjoyment or pleasure. It's actually because he wants to give us a better, fuller life. And that's true of every single command that God gives to his people, every single chapter in the story. Creation, and now the fall.
All right, who here has seen the Avengers movies? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Without my kid. So there we go. In the first Avengers movie, who is the villain? Loki is the villain. Am I correct? Are we on board here? If you take Loki out of the first movie, what kind of a movie do you have? Boring. Second movie, who is the villain? The Age of Ultron. Or is that the third movie? I forget. Huh? Ultron. You take Ultron out of the movie, what kind of a movie do you have? What? Boring. Who are they going to fight if you take Ultron out? That's the point.
A short movie.
Yeah, that's right. You have Little House on the Prairie, and Tony Stark in his apron making cookies.
Back up some.
All right, last movie. Endgame. Who is the villain? Who? Thanos. You take Thanos out of the movie. You take him out of the future. You take him out of the present. You take him out of the past. Since he seems to move around quite a bit in all those places, what kind of a movie do you have?
Short.
Short, yeah. A short movie. A really short movie. When you are writing something, you need to have conflict. If there's no conflict, there is no interest. So when you get to Genesis, we do not have Loki, we do not have Ultron, we do not have Thanos. We have who? Should have brought Berkeley. The serpent. I learned in Sunday school this week from somebody who told me that his dad said that the serpent was the devil. What was the word he used? I forget. Anyway, turns into it was a better word than that. But I leave it to the kindergarten kid to come up with the big word, and then the pastor can't come up with the big word. So your conflict is going to be between who? The serpent, the devil, and Adam and Eve. And there you go. So, what is the nature of sin? What is sin? What is sin? You may not define sin with any churchy kind of language this evening. You can't do it. What is sin? Sin hurts who? Hurts yourself, and it hurts. Who's it hurt?
Ow.
Others. Okay? It hurts others. My wife is going to come home and punch me.
He just punched me, just so you know.
Okay, that's why I'm out of frame. I was busy beating my wife. I'll never make it to the Supreme Court now, okay? That's how that goes. Sin hurts others and it hurts yourself. Does it hurt God? No. God is incapable of being hurt. May make him sad, may make him regret some things, but God's kind of self-sufficient that way. So it hurts us, and it hurts you, and it hurts the people around you. So, what does the serpent say to Eve? How does it start? What's the first words out of her mouth? His mouth. Ooh, we could make the devil a she. There you go. It'll be equality. Well, I went to school and we were doing all this inclusive stuff, and you had to, what the question was whether we were going to refer to God as in the feminine, and my Old Testament professor said, well, that's good, and we should refer to the devil in the feminine as well. And all of a sudden, all the women got very quiet. They didn't like that. However, wisdom in the Old Testament, by the way, is feminine, just in case you know, and so is folly. They're both feminine characters in the book of Proverbs. So there you go. What's the first words out of the serpent's mouth? Did God say? Did God say? And that is how the story begins, and that is how sin begins. Did God say? You and your brothers and sisters are sitting around, and your mom and dad are not home, and the first words out of your mouth is, well, did mom actually say that we couldn't have anything to eat until supper? Did dad actually say that we couldn't go into the shop? Am I being sexist or what? Go into the shop and start the tools. Ooh. Did they actually say? And that's how it begins. You begin with the question of authority. Sin doesn't begin by somebody picking up an axe and throwing it at somebody, not usually. Most sin starts out by saying, well, did they really say? How do you know you sinned? Anybody under 18, when you have done something that you know that your parents have told you you do not do, how do you know? What? Guilt? That little voice on the inside that says, oh, as you get older, you will learn to quell your guilt a lot better, okay? You just will learn to not listen anywhere as near as well. So if you can kind of keep that at the forefront, there's a little voice inside of you right now that makes you feel like you have let the cat out of the bag, you've done something that you aren't supposed to do, and you will feel incredibly guilty. And what is the first thing you do when you feel guilty and mom and dad come home, like they did one day when my brother got into the chocolate chip cookies, and we have mushrooms everywhere in the kitchen. Do you remember mushrooms everywhere in the kitchen? I remember mushrooms. The cookie jar was a giant mushroom, and it was ceramic. Oh, yes. And my brother was probably a good 4 feet tall, but to get to the cookie jar, you needed to be 5 feet tall. So if he stretched way back to the back of the shelf, he could just barely reach the cookie jar. The cookie jar didn't make it off the shelf into his arms, it made it off the shelf and onto the floor. Fortunately, the cookie jar hit his feet and survived. The lid, on the other hand, hit the floor, and it did not survive. I wasn't aware that my brother knew where the Elmer's glue was. And so, he took the Elmer's glue, and what do you suppose he did with it? He tried to put the cookie jar lid back together and put it on the lid. Now, you probably have no experience in this area at all. But I would just ask you, does anybody know how well Elmer's glue works on? No, it doesn't. So, when my mother came home to check the cookie jar, because she was a trusting soul, that woman, and she had counted the cookies before she left. I don't know how mothers know these things, but she lifted the jar off to see, and the lid came off, came apart in her hands. But the point is that my brother was trying to hide it. And when you sin, what you are trying to do is hide it. So how does a parent know when a child is doing something they shouldn't be doing? I don't know if we should be telling these massive secrets. Mine's 18 and he's gone and he's not here, so I don't know if we should be telling these secrets with parents and kids here in the same room. But how do they know? How do they know? You look like you are hiding something and you feel guilty and your cheeks get all red, right? You've done something you shouldn't have done, and unless you're really smooth, and that kind of smoothness takes practice and doesn't usually come till high school, but for a little while anyway, parents are pretty good. They can understand. The first thing you do when you sin is you go for the fig leaf to cover it up. You understand what I'm saying? You go get the fig leaf because you are guilty. And you don't want your parents to see what you have done, and you don't really want your parents to see you because you are embarrassed. Or you will be after they get done with you. That's how that goes. So, sin is about hurting yourself and others, and it is about guilt. And the author talked a little bit about shame. Because the text will tell us that Adam and Eve were ashamed. You remember what he said the difference between shame and guilt is? Guilt is what? Dropping the cookie jar, breaking the lid?
You've done something bad.
You've done something bad. Shame is what?
You are bad.
What is shame?
You are.
What? You are bad. You are bad. Not just that you're wrong, but you are bad. And so therefore you are ashamed. And when you have shame, you go for the fig leaves. Because you're going to hide. So that is kind of the nature of sin, and that is the problem. That is the conflict that we have being set up in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Let's see. Just a couple of other notes. What kind of shape was the apple in? Kind of wormy, got holes in it? Was it rotted? No. What does the text tell us about the apple? It's not really an apple. We have no idea what kind of fruit it was. I'm voting olive, because when I was over there, I saw tons of olive trees. But it could have been pomegranate. It could have been a date. I'll tell you why I think it was an olive in just a minute. What kind of fruit was it? It was pleasing to the eye. I am amazed at the number of people who believe that committing sin is horrible and ugly and painful. It is later. If when you look at it, it was horrible, ugly, and painful, you wouldn't do it. The most tempting things are the ones that are mostly right, or that look good, or feel good, or are pleasant. So, you ask any alcoholic, and they will tell you, there is nothing better on the face of the earth than the next drink. Talk to any cocaine addict. I don't know if we're addicted to cocaine anymore. Usually it's meth. Although heroin has made a comeback, I guess. Any of those things. They will tell you there is nothing like the next hit. And all of them feel good at the time until you get into the cycle. And it eats your life up. All of those things. So, it was pleasing to the eye. So, you need to remember that about sin. Sin is not necessarily something that is going to scare you off. It's going to be something that will lure you in. Sorry, this is where my notes are for the presentation. The other thing that sin does is it sets you up as God. God is God and you are not. You need to remember that. God is God and you are not. So when you try and figure out what's right and what's wrong, who decides what's right and wrong? How do mom and dad decide? Okay, very clear. How do mom and dad decide what's wrong, right and wrong? You go to God, right? God created everything. God knows how it's supposed to work. So in the story that we have, what happens is Adam and Eve want to be God. They want to make the decisions as to what's right and what's wrong and how things work. So when we do that, that is a sin that the author is talking about. So let me ask you this question. Would you rather be trapped in a good world that's broken or a bad world? Last week we talked about the bad world. That would be the one that was created in conflict, where parents are eating their children and eating their wives and killing each other and ripping them apart and using body parts for planets and stars and all that kind of stuff. Which would you rather be in? Would you rather be in a good world gone bad or a bad world? Just a plain old bad world. And why? What do you think? Lee, you want to be in a good world gone bad or just a plain old bad world? Personal opinion. What do you think, Dwayne?
I think I would want to be in a good world gone bad.
Okay,
Because then there's a chance for it to go back to being good.
that's right. I think y'all want to be in a good world gone bad because there is a chance. There is a chance that it will go back, that it will go back to being good. I learned a couple of things this week I wanted to share with you. A good Bible study means I will always learn something. So I've learned something, so we can skip the rest of the Bible study and go on, because I've learned something this week. I learned about the hanging tree. Did you all catch that in the reading this week? Did you all catch the hanging tree? That's why I think it was an olive tree, because dates come from palms, and you can't hang anybody from a palm tree. And I've never seen a pomegranate tree, so I have no idea whether you can hang somebody. But olive trees will get big enough, and they're strong enough. And I got to see an olive tree that was around at the same time Jesus was. It was 2,000 years old. Can you imagine? One olive tree that was 2,000 years old. And it was outside of Herod's palace, where Salome gave her dance and then asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. So that tree was there when that happened. It was just a wee spry thing at the time, but it was there. And olive trees are like family members, which will probably sound really strange to you. But what you get from olives is you get olives from olives, and you can trade them, barter them. You get oil from them. You can keep your house lit at night. You can keep your salad tossed and fresh with the oil. You can do all kinds of things with the oil. Olive trees are indispensable. So let's just picture the serpent and Adam and Eve underneath the olive tree for just a moment. And the serpent comes up and says, what's the serpent say? What was that? Did God really say? Of course he did. Of course he did. And what did we give Adam and Eve last week? Do you remember? Who rules the world in God's stead? Adam and Eve, right? It is their job to do what? To keep the world in harmony. Keep the world in harmony. Keep all the wheels running so that nothing gets clogged up, nothing gets broke down, which means that everything and everybody has got to follow God and God's plan. So, when the serpent walks up and says, did God really say that? What I took away from the lesson this week was that he did it underneath a hanging tree. And that Adam and Eve, as stewards of God's world, that's like the stewards of Gondor, but that's another movie for another time. They're stewards. What they should have done was what? You got a villain, you got a hanging tree, and you got somebody who's saying, I'm not sure God's in control. What do? You hang the snake. I'm not sure how you're going to get the rope around his neck. But at the very least, Adam and Eve, their job was to pronounce judgment on the snake. I don't know how many times I've read that story, and it has never occurred to me that we just gave Adam and Eve power and control over the entire earth. It's dependent on God's rule. Snake comes up and says, well, I'm not sure God's leveling with you, and I'm not sure God's doing everything right. Maybe your job was to dispose of the snake and pass judgment on the snake and preserve creation. And Adam and Eve fail. They fail. They're underneath a hanging tree. So that's the insight I got out of this lesson this week. So at the very end, when we have the snake, there is a prophecy. I don't expect you to know Greek or Latin, and that's okay. I wish I didn't have to learn it. I'm not sure how much I still remember. I knew enough to understand what he was saying. He talks about the first gospel and the prophecy that is the first gospel. And the prophecy that God gives is that what's the snake going to do to the heel of men? What's the snake going to do? What's that? Bruise it. How's it going to bruise it? Going to bite it, right? Going to bite it. We have a euphemism there. We're going to bite the heel of the human, and the human is going to probably die. At the same time, the other half of the prophecy is, what's the human going to do to the snake? What's that? Crush it. Stomp on its head. I've seen many a person. I don't stomp on it. They go for the shovel. That's usually what they go for. And smack the living daylights out of that puppy. Huh? Or a hoe. There we go. My aim's not good enough for a hoe. I got to have a shovel. So there you go. So if the snake is going to kill the man and the man is going to kill the snake, how does that all work? How do you get rid of the snake? And therein lies the conundrum and the promise that nobody can understand for several thousand years, right? Because the only man who can be killed by the snake and kill the snake at the same time is going to be Jesus. The sin of the world is going to kill him, but the grace of God will raise him again from the dead. And then in so doing, he will destroy the devil. So there you go. There was something else I want to talk about, but I'm done. Do you have any questions about what you read? I didn't ask anybody for any questions last week. Did you have any questions? This is the time to take questions.
You're on battery saver.
Okay, it's fine. No questions? None whatsoever? Are we good? Yes, sir.
You think Adam and Eve were flawed from the start and on their creation?
That's the question I wanted to ask.
Made to be flawed after the fall.
There you go. There's the question. And the bigger question is, why is there a snake in the garden in the first place? You remember the answer the author gave? It's complicated. I thought, well, there's a bailout if ever there wasn't, but he's got a PhD and I just got a master's degree, so we'll let him go on that. But it's a good question. It's maybe one of the most important questions of the story.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, we think that Adam and Eve are flawed from the beginning, or are they perfect until they get the temptation? So what do you think? Every newborn baby is just perfect, right? And they're lovable, and they never do anything wrong until they wake you up 8 days in a row at 3 o'clock in the morning, until they throw up and they poop and you do all that other stuff, right? Babies are adorable, and they're perfect. I had a friend who used to tell the story. He is a retired pastor in Western New York, and he used to talk about his son Jed. And I have no idea what Jed thinks about the story now that he's a grown man. But they used to live in Arkport, and the parsonage kind of backed up to a very busy road. And Jeff would set the boundary for the big wheel. Do we know what a big wheel is? We all know what a big wheel is? All right, good. So the little guy was on a big wheel, and Jeff said, end of the driveway is as far as you go. So we take this perfect, adorable, he was the cutest kid. Cute as a button. I'd take him home in a minute. And you put him on the big wheel. Joe, what do you think he did, Joe? You're a parent. Right out into the street, baby. Right out into the street. So, was he flawed from the beginning? It's complicated. Because people are made both in the image of God and corrupted by sin. And you hold both those things together. I wrote in the newsletter, if you read the newsletter, somebody asked me that question. Do I tend to see people as basically good or basically bad? And the answer is yes. They're both, but I tend to worry about the bad half because that's the one that'll hurt me. So what do I think? I think that's what the serpent is there to answer. Whether they're going to stay good or whether there's a, I mean, you aren't guilty until you've done something, I suppose. But the seed's in there, the potential is in there, right? So I'm thinking something was wrong. Which I guess then begs the question, does God create imperfect things? And at that point, the question just got beyond my pay grade. It's complicated. Now the guy with the master's degree is going to say, it's complicated. And I'm not prepared to go there tonight, Joe, okay? I don't know if that answers your question. But if you answered that they were corrupt from the beginning, which I'm thinking they have to be in order to answer that question, then you got to ask yourself, well, what was God doing when he created it? Created us.
Well, maybe it wasn't that they were created corrupted, but they were created to have the possibility of.
See, and that's where you need a philosophy major to come in here and talk about the possibility. There's a possibility. Because you aren't really guilty till you make the choice. And I think God's got to know. I think heaven puts a high premium on our freedom of choice. I think a lot goes on in this world so that we can keep our freedom of choice. Probably more than we think. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, a lot of it, I think, stems from allowing us to have free choice in the matter. So, does that answer your question, Joe? Did you want to do a follow-up? No, now that I've told you the question gets beyond my pay grade, you're not going to. It's complicated, and it really is. I mean, there are whole books on that kind of thing. But that was the other thing I wanted to talk about was why on earth did God put the serpent in the garden? And why does Mom bake chocolate chip cookies and leave them on the shelf when she knows you could get into them? Why would she do that? Why would she tempt you like that? It's almost the same question. Almost the same question. But some mothers don't. Some mothers put everything up in upper cabinets and they lock everything and they childproof everything. And even the toilet seat has a cover on it that you need a combination to open. I won't tell you how I know these things. So you even have covers to go on your fireplace hearth ends, okay? So that the kid doesn't slip, fall, and smack his head on the stone. Any other questions? This is your time to ask.